Over the past 4 decades, even as tennis has gone relentlessly global, Australia has remained a pillar of the sport. On both the men's side and on the women's, Australians have reached the top spot in the rankings. And Aussies have been champs at Wimbledon, in New York, and on the clay of Paris. What's more, Australia has given us tennis characters, Hall of Fame doubles players, and killer coaches. The Australian Open has grown immeasurably and is now on par with the other majors. But here's a tennis feat Australia hasn't achieved over the last 4 decades, serving up a homegrown singles winner at the Australian Open. There have been a few close calls. Leighton Hewitt reached the finals, Pat Cash made the last round 2 straight years, and another Aussie Pat, Rafter, reached the semis. But the last time an Aussie won the title here, well, it makes for a good bit of trivia. For the men, it was Mark Edmondson in 1976. For the women, well, you win if you knew the answer was Chris O'Neill in 1978. More interesting, the why. Why has it been so long since Aussies have done in Melbourne what they've successfully done elsewhere? Well, there have been some rough draws, great players from other countries, and there have been some rough conditions. And remember, Australia is home to just 25 million citizens, a smaller population than that of Texas. And therein might lie the best explanation. This island is by far the smallest of the 4 Grand Slam nations, so when the show comes to town, it's a big deal. And local players take the court freighted with pressure. Pat Rafter has talked about it, and so has Mark Philippoussis, a finalist in New York and at Wimbledon who never got beyond round 4 in Melbourne. You've heard of a home court advantage? This sport can offer the opposite effect.
It's a beautiful court in front of a packed house. There's nothing better.
And here now comes Ash Barton, the first Aussie woman in the Open era to enter her home major as the top seed. We'll see if she can reverse the curse. Never mind 7 opponents, she'll need to triumph over an eager and attentive sporting public. That's what it will take for a local to come good, and as they say here, finally come up over, down under.
Well, so here it is, maybe some hopefuls still to come to win and break that curse. It was Mark Edmondson and Chris O'Neill, the last Aussies to win in singles on the men's and women's side. And when Chris O'Neill won it, it was a 32 draw, and half of the players were Aussies. So I don't know how much you can look into that. There's Chris O'Neill, 1978, Mark Edmondson, 1976. A lot of interesting stats in this, John. When you were putting this together, what kind of surprised you? What did you learn?
I think some of this is just a function of, globalization and numbers, and you forget that Australia has only 30 million people. It's done pretty well for itself in tennis. But I also think there is so much pressure on Aussie players. We saw it most recently with Ash Barty, who played last year as the #1 seed. But I remember, Lindsay, I don't know if you remember this, even Alicia Malik gets to week 2, and suddenly there's a camera crew at her house, and here's what she ate for dinner last night. I mean, it's the same way as French players in Paris. I think sometimes we forget. The U.S. Open goes on, and it's great, and we love it, but it's not as though the sporting public, much less the country, stops to keep an eye on the American players. There is just such a different perspective and so much more pressure and attention on Aussie players down under.
Yeah, it seems like that trickles down because there's players ranked anywhere from 50 to 150, and they're known in the Australian public. They're well-followed sports figures. It's a very popular sport, and it does take over the nation, especially traditionally in January when all the players arrive, always on the covers of newspapers. You feel that pressure. I mean, we've seen Sam Stosur just absolutely crumble. She has been such a great player, won the U.S. Open. She can't play there. She feels the pressure so much, and that's been the same with some of the other players. Ash Barty had a tough time last year in the semifinals when all of a sudden it got real. Okay, I'm 2 matches away from potentially winning this. I think it just means so much to them.
Yeah, I think in a weird way, the smaller countries makes it much more difficult, as you guys have said, because the focus is there. You talk about the United States and the U.S. Open, And while it is the trophy carrier of all of our tournaments, it's also at the start of the NFL season. You know, we are part of the sports landscape, but it's nowhere near the magnitude of the other countries. So that adds a lot of pressure. And also, I think we see it much more in tennis in general because it's an individual sport. No matter what you do, you can't rely on someone else to bail you out. And so pressure, I think, is magnified.
But you've had, in Australia, Grand Slam champions. You've had Pat Rafter, you've had Pat Cash, you've had Leighton Hewitt, you've had Sam Stosur and Ash Barty. I mean, when you talk about France, it's that same sort of pressure. They have not. When you talk about, Great Britain, it's that same sort of pressure.
They had a few. Mauresmo and Pierce were able to.
They were.
Yeah.
They were able to. Why not Australia?
Oh, why not? Mauresmo never able to win at the French, but a Grand Slam champion. Who knows? They're the most prepared. They obviously get to train there in those conditions. I think that it comes down to the pressure that they feel, whether they're being written about or, as Wertheim says, once they make a run, the attention even magnifies on them. Surface has changed a couple of times over the last 10, 15 years. It'll be interesting. What do you think? How is the junior development in Australia?
Yeah, that was the next thing. I mean, I was fortunate enough to spend a few years there with Craig Tiley, and Pat Rafter was head of player development for a while now, Wally Massour. And it's like what we have here in the USTA on a different version, and the themes are the same. There are less kids playing. There are less kids staying to play, yet you want more champions. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So there is a chain reaction that goes up the developmental segments of a player's career, and you got to get more young players, and you got to get your best athletes doing it. But I think everyone's doing the right thing, and I also think things are just cyclical too.
Certainly one of the players that could break through. We'll talk about him for a long time. Nick Kyrgios, 25 years old. He has made the quarterfinals there. That was back in 2015, fourth round last year, John. Haven't seen him play since February. Where do you think Kyrgios is at coming into the Australian Open?
I think that's a great question because I think Kyrgios is one player who is sort of inoculated from this pressure. I think this is a guy who's going to go, bring it on. I would love to play with cameras. I don't think he's the kind of person that's going to feel this hometown pressure. But the problem is, you say, Steve, I mean, this is from last year. He had a very nice Australian Open, and he got to the round 4 and then played Rafa. No shame in that. And you sort of look at Nick Kyrgios and you sort of say, who knows? I mean, he has not played a match since February. And you remember by his choice, he took off a lot of time. We all know his training can be a bit of a moving target. So, right now he's hovering around 50. And young buck Nick Kyrgios is now closer to age 30 than he is to 20. It's a big question mark. But I think one of the ironies here is this is a guy who actually embraces all the pressure that we talked about that guys like Pat Rafter and Sam Stosur may have bristled from a little bit. But Kyrgios is a big question mark right now, just given this layoff.
I think, it's an interesting study, Nick is. And all along as we've watched him play, we know how talented he is. We know that he can beat the best players in the world. And I always argued that those are the easy matches for him. He's not supposed to win those matches. And when you're that talented and you're that gifted, it's actually easier to play Roger or Rafa or Novak than it is to play someone that's ranked 26 or 18 or 76 when you're supposed to win. So while I agree with John in terms of the talent level, I actually would say that I disagree a little bit because when expectation does get there, it's a semi or a final, and there is expectation, and there is all that kind of pressure. That's one thing, and that's one place where we will see it with Kyrgios. The other thing is, historically, he's even said he hasn't been fit enough to play 7 3 out of 5 set matches. So while the physical gifts are there, I think the other stuff remains to be seen. I think it would be a great spectacle to see him in the semi or final, but I actually do think if he gets to that spot, he'll be great if he's winning and he'll get the fans into it, but it is a totally different kind of pressure that he would feel.
And now being around 50 in the world, maybe even less pressure for him than if he was ranked in the top 20, something like that. Ash Barty, obviously, she's got the target on her back. She's the top seed, #1 ranked player in the world. However, Lindsay, we've always talked about how cool, calm, chill she is. She has that sort of demeanor. Quarterfinals 2 years ago, semifinals last year, progressing. What does she need to do to make that next step?
Yeah, she was so close last year, and she was an overwhelming favorite going into the semifinal against Sofia Kenin. It was a blazing hot day. Okay, Ash grows up in that. She trains in that. She should have the advantage. And she really wilted a bit under the pressure against playing Kenin and also the crowd and also being the favorite. Interesting, she tried to downplay expectations right after she went to the post-match press conference, brought her knee, goes on, it'll be fine. At some point, as the world #1, you've got to embrace it and be a little bit more bummed out. I could have won this tournament. I'm going to work hard not to. We'll see. It's not really her mindset. She's very happy-go-lucky. She's another player we haven't seen on tour since last February. So we're not totally sure what to expect tennis-wise. We know she's been golfing well. We know she's been separated from her coach because of the state restrictions in Australia. Also, let's keep in mind, we're not going to have full capacity. Does that make it better for the Aussies, or does the crowd pull them through some of those matches? I don't know. We'll have to see how all of these players kind of respond to the different conditions. It'll be unlike anything they've ever played in Australia before.
What do you think?
That's a great point. I actually think that the less crowd there, if the players get to the end of the tournament, the Australian players, it's going to be easier for them.